Ladies and gentlemen, global power politics have changed fundamentally within the past 5 years. And it's astonishing at which incredible speed formerly successful countries are governed into the ground while others have their fulminant rise. A fulminant rise up to the multipolar world order of the Air Age. And in this new world order, there is one new global power, #1, namely China. China, so far in former decades, has been this yearning place of Eastern philosophy. Then afterwards, China has been quite popular for being the production site of our globe that prolongs with their resources our wealth and our income. Within the past 10 years, China has been increasingly seen as quite critical and as quite hostile. Yeah, some of the cliches are, this is the red danger in the East. It's the communistic end state with its social scoring system. It surveils the people and steers them and manipulates them. It violates copyright, so it sucks our technologies and our know-how and then takes all our markets in a very unfair way. China, the country that buys everything, that buys traditional US companies as well as the half of Africa. So these are all the cliches, these are all the stereotypes, and this is all the propaganda that many of us have in their heads when thinking of China. But the reality, the truth is completely different. And on this truth, I want to make an astrological view now in this video. Especially since spring 2025, our perspective on China has changed considerably. Because what happened back then, in April, Donald Trump started his tariffs circus. So it began that all countries in this world didn't take the US serious anymore as a reliable partner in global economy. The next thing is this warmonger of Donald Trump. Countries of the NATO, they should spend 3.5 or at least 5% of their gross national product into weapons, and the US, of course, they won't participate in this, but they will be happy to sell the weapons to us. Yeah, so it's quite obvious that the cowboy with the smoking colt is just such a deep part of the American DNA, you cannot get rid of it. And you also see it in the Near East, you also see it in all these activities around Israel, how deep America is involved into violence. And in this very stormy, in this very unpredictable spheres of global politics, suddenly China seems quite reliable. China seems like the only calm and wise and long-term oriented global power on our globe. So these old pictures of China, they are not valid anymore. I mean, the elder of us who experienced China in the 1950s, 1960s, 1970s, they have pictures like this in their head, the blue ants all in their Mao suit, working hard and being completely in line, being completely collectivized. Then all these communistic monumental buildings or all these quite poor agriculture surroundings, this is by far not valid anymore, because in the late 1970s, after the reign of Mao, there came Deng Xiaoping and he opened China to the West. He started with this politics of one land, two systems. So he developed these special economy zones, especially on the coast, like Shanghai and Shenzhen and so forth, and he opened them to market capitalism. And so China had economic growth rates of 10% and more year by year over decades. And even nowadays, it's still 5, 6, 7% per year that the Chinese economy is growing. Yeah, and Deng Xiaoping had one vision. He said, be silent and wait for your time. So don't make much spectacle around all that you have achieved. Don't be proud. Don't go like this on the world stage, but remain silent, remain decent, and remain in the background, because otherwise others will come and want to destroy what you have achieved. And then in the 1990s, 2000s, it started this huge wave of transferring production lines from the US, from Europe to China, because their labor was much cheaper. It was much easier to earn money, and for our companies it was very comfortable. We just sit back and relax and count our money, and China is doing all the work for us. But of course, they were not stupid. They said, okay, what you teach us, what you show us from your technologies, what you show us from production sites and from know-how, of course, in the first step, we are going to serve you, but then in the second and the third step, we will build our own businesses. And this is what got quite obvious in the 2010s, when Western countries increasingly saw China in a critical way. They saw more the competition. And one secret weapon of the global South against the Western dominion, hardly anybody is seeing, but this is air conditioning, because air conditioning allows countries even in the hot South to work as long and as focused as the people in the north and build up their economies. So you also can see in line the synchronicity between the economic upswing of China and the upswing of the usage of air conditioning in China. And the major reason for this impressive rise of the Chinese dragon are the astrological long-term cycles. China is embedded into these cycles in an excellent way. We see it here. You know this chart from my former presentations. This is the cycle of Jupiter-Saturn conjunctions in the elements. So we always have 200 years of earth, of air, of water, of fire, and then it returns after 800 years. And you can see the last Earth age started in 1802 with the mutation conjunction in Virgo. And then 40 years of a hybrid phase started, and then in 1842 we had the final beginning of the last Earth age in Capricorn. And what happened back then, you can see here a very revealing chart of the percentage on the gross domestic product between the different world powers. And you can see up until the year 1800, China was by far the biggest world economy. It took more than a third of what has been achieved in economy across the globe. And then the Earth Age started, and the Chinese economy shrinked in an incredible way. It was completely devastated and destroyed. Up until 1980, when the new Air Age started, and then this gigantic rise of China began to take place. Yeah, so this is the astrological reason behind. But what happened back then in the early 1800s? Yeah, it was a huge plague of opium back then. So the Anglo-Saxons, most of all the British Empire, they illegally imported opium into China. First reason was to narcotize the whole nation. It got very weak and nothing worked there anymore. And the second reason was just to earn money. So the downfall of millions of people just to earn money. And this led to the situation that China got a very negative trade balance. So they spent much more silver to buy opium than they were able to export. And this was the beginning of the Chinese downfall in world economy. So we see in the last Earth Age, China had a double violated Neptune. Yeah, what means double violated Neptune? I mean, those of you who ever has visited a seminar of mine know in chronolix astrology every constellation, every planet has specific degrees of cultivations. You can cultivate it on the very base and low level, at the very undeveloped level, or at the very developed level. And the undeveloped levels of this double violated Neptune, the first one was this opium wave, which also led to the Opium Wars in 1839. And the second was communism, yeah, the plague of the last decades of the Earth age. So these two extremely negative experiences of a violated Neptune led to the situation that China started to cultivate its Neptune, and now it's more like a collectivistic welfare orientation that is now taking place in Chinese politics. And if you go to this country now in 2025, then you have to see, the new air age, it's not a vision, it's not science fiction, it's reality in China already nowadays. They are at the level of technization in the vein of the air age that probably Europe or the US won't reach until the year 2050. It's really like a trip into the future. And the basis of this enormous development, first of all, of course, is economic growth. 5 to 10% of economic growth in the past decades. They led to the situation that the gross national product in 2025 is 20 billion US dollars compared to 30 billion US dollars of the USA. But this is just the nominal values. If you take the gross national product weighted on purchase parity, then China has already beaten the US in 2014. And if you look at the trade balance, the USA have a very negative trade balance. This is the reason why Donald Trump started now these trade wars, this tariff circus, because the US nearly has 1 billion of a negative trade balance. Instead, China has 990 billion US dollar positive trade balance. So it's a similar situation like in the 1840s, where we had the Opium Wars, but back then the Anglo-Saxons had their a positive trade balance and China a very negative one, and now it's vice versa. So we really know what we can expect in the future here. And China has analyzed successful players in world economy very profoundly. They want to achieve prosperity, that they want to achieve an economic upswing, but in a different way as others have done before. So the first point is they want to have an economic upswing without wars and without any military conflict, because military conflict always destroy resources. So their motto is victory without war. They don't want to get involved into any military conflicts. The second point that they want to make different is economic upswing without destruction of the environment. The third one is economic upswing without poverty, without slums, without all these very negative social side effects that have been seen in other countries. And then they want to achieve this economic upswing without the dominance of libertarians, without the dominance of tech oligarchs, of economic oligarchs that take all these monies and these resources into their hands. In China, they want to have it on a collectivistic level. And of course, they also don't want any election democracy there. So these are really 5 very profound differences of the Chinese upswing and any other economic upswings in the past. And one reason why they chose their own path, why they chose their own way, are 2 very deep collective traumata that they experienced in the past. The first one is famine. You really have to bear in mind that just within the last 150 years, China experienced 6 very catastrophic events of famine with 1 up to 10 million dead people and victims. The last one took place from 1959 to 1961, and this was caused by Mao Zedong's Great Leap Forward. This was a communistic program that wanted to reshape the whole economy, and it was such a disaster that agriculture didn't work anymore, and something between 20 and 60 million people starved to death. And if you have this collective trauma in your neck, then of course you do everything that you will not get into this situation anymore in the future. So working hard, working for prosperity in China is also of course caused by this big collective trauma. And the second trauma is war. From 1937 to 1945, China has been invaded by Japan because Japan wanted to conquer China and to get its resources. And most people don't know, but in the Second World War, most civil victims have been taking place in China. So 15 million people died by war in China. And so also the second point, we don't want to have any war anymore in the future, is also deep in the DNA of China. So completely contrary to the cowboy mentality of the USA, who always have to guide wars somewhere across the globe. Yeah, and which is very fascinating in China is that they want to have this economic growth without destruction of the environment. I have been in China in 2018, and the first thing that I realized was this acid air that stunk into my lungs. Yeah, it was really completely poisoned air there. And now, just a couple of years later, in 2025, if you leave the aeroplane in Beijing, everything is clean, everything is silent, everything is very comfortable. You see trees and plants everywhere. It's a completely different world. Yeah, I mean, they managed it in such a short period of time. You just have to bear in mind, in 2020, only 6% of new cars have been electric. Now in 2025, just 5 years later, it's more than 50%. Germany instead only has 14%, and US also much, much lower than in China. And how did they manage it? First of all, of course, with gigantic subventions. Yeah, this is also one reason why Chinese electric cars are so cheap, and this is also what the European Union and the US are criticizing with Chinese car. But they also have kind of regularities, like they decide by lot if somebody is allowed to drive a combustion engine in a city. So it's very difficult to achieve these licenses, and so most people prefer to buy an electric car because it's just much more easy and comfortable to drive in the cities with it. And the third point is they don't have any taxes on electric cars, and with these 3 means they achieved really completely smog-free big cities in China. Next thing that you realize when traveling Chinese cities are these miles and miles and endless miles of termite buildings. Giant skyscrapers that reach into the skies and into the horizons, and it looks quite strange, especially for the European eye, because here nobody would like to live in such anonymous skyscrapers. But when you go inside, it really looks everything very nice. You have gardens and much green inside, and there are also at the entrances of these buildings, there are always people who watch that no nonsense is happening inside. And if you are in one of those flats in the 30, 40, 50th floor, then you really have a nice view across the city. Yeah, and they managed it to build all these in a very short period of time. Of course, these buildings are not perfect. Yeah, if you look with the German eye onto it, you see much like cables looking out of the walls, or rain dropping through the roof, but it's fast and people have a quite high living standard there. Nobody has to live in slums. So the Chinese really are masters in steering streams of people. And one very important technology here, of course, is digitalization. And in China, for example, nobody is paying with cash. Everybody just uses apps. Everything is just working digitally. You go into a restaurant and you have the menu there. You choose what you want to eat. You press the button and it's paid and it's ordered at the same time. So the cook only has to concentrate on producing the food and not so much on all the surroundings anymore. And of course, this is very comfortable, but if you are not in track, then you can be excluded quite easily. For example, you have a new haircut and the automatic registration just doesn't recognize you anymore, then you're completely locked out of it. And of course you also have censorship, you have surveillance, you have all these topics, but in the US, in Europe, you have the same issues, but there is not the state who has all this data, there it's just big companies who have these data. What's very important, I mean, most of us here in the West think that China has this social scoring system where they surveil their people, where they sanctionize if somebody is misbehaving, but the reality is there is no such social scoring system so far in China. It was a concept around 10 years ago, but it was never implemented. So this is only Western propaganda which is focusing on that. And I mean, we have surveillance capitalism in the West, which is by far the worst alternative. One interesting thing is the Great Chinese Firewall, which blocks the Chinese internet from the outside. Of course, you can trick it with VPN, but most Chinese, they are not interested in it because they don't know English anyway, and so the international internet is not interesting for them anyway. China has managed to only let into the mental sphere, into their net, things that they think are positive for their people. So you don't have any of those Western surveillance machines and social destruction machines like Google, like Facebook, like Instagram and so on. You even don't have all these very crappy newspaper websites. They're all blocked, but you have all the high quality content from the West, of course, you can visit from the Chinese internet without any problem. So to astrology.de, to my website, for example, you can even get from China without any problems. So this shows that digital life also works without all these Meta and Google and Apple companies. Another point that is in the head of many people is this state capitalism, or even this ghost of communism that China is associated quite much. But you have just to ask yourself, which is a communistic state? A state that takes much of its people's property, or a state that takes little of its people's property? And there are two very interesting economic indicators for that. The first one is the tax quote, the tax ratio. It shows how much money the state is taking from your well-deserved income. And which one is really a communistic state? A state that takes 41% of its people's incomes by taxes, or even 44%, or a state that takes 22% of it via taxes. And the next is the public quota, the public ratio, which shows how much of the gross domestic product is spent by the state. Which state is really communistic? A state that takes 50% with a state quota of 50%, or a state with a state quota of 33%. So you see, this technoid neo-communism is not valid anymore for China. It's more like a prosperity, a welfare, a collectivistic welfare economy. Of course, China doesn't allow any elections because it's just not part of their mentality. I've explained it a couple of times already. In China, there is this concept of heavenly command, and the Chinese emperor, he has to fulfill this heavenly command. So he's not just allowed to know everything about his people, he's even forced to know everything about his people to make wise decisions. So everything is organized in a much more collectivistic way. So the whole is much, much more important than the single person. The collective is much more important than the individual. Western individualism, where people think they are so important with their personality, in the Chinese view, it's more like a small child, a little child that is crying and screaming all the time, I want, I want, I want, I want. But this is seen as quite base in the Chinese world perspective. And so it's not surprising that if you walk through these megacities of China, everything is very silent and peaceful and mindful, compared to Western cities. And I just made a video about the 10 failures and problems of Western democracies, and China has solved many of those with their unique political system, because in the end it's not a communism, it's a meritocracy, which means a rulership of the smartest minds. The selection processes within Chinese politics is very strict and very severe and very quality oriented. First, you have to prove yourself over years in your small area, in your district, in your province. And just when you made very excellent work there, then you can step upwards and finally, if you are very smart and very brave, finally get into the inner circle of the communistic party that decides and rules over the whole of China. Yeah, and I mean, with 1.5 billion people, inhabitants, of course, a country cannot be organized in the same way as a small country like Germany with 80 million people. It's not possible anymore that everybody has to decide everything democratically, because then nothing would work anymore. So we see after this immense downfall of China during the last Earth Age, now the Chinese dragon is back and ready for the Air Age. And so far in the next couple of years, we still have the opportunity to talk with China on one level, because it's quite a balance of power, but the negative thing is that our power curve is going downwards while the Chinese is going upwards, and so we meet in the middle. So really, let's use the next couple of years to establish a really trustful relationship with China. And Asia will not just take over economically in the global power systems, but also in a cultural way. If you look back the last decades, everything has been dominated by the Anglo-Saxon culture. It started around the year 1900 with blues and jazz, and then there came rock and roll, and then there came pop and Britpop and all that stuff, rock music. Everybody sang in English. Everything was just trying to copy these prototypes of Anglo-Saxon cultures. And in the spheres of movies, of films, there was this immense dominance of Hollywood. And now after all these decades of Anglo-Saxon cultures, most people are sick of it, especially during the Corona lockdowns. Many of us got a Netflix overdose, so looking all these movies, watching all these series on Netflix from the US, you see, it's always just the same. It's always just the same boring and dull scripts repeating and repeating and repeating themselves. It's nothing new anymore. It's just boring and worn out. And it's no coincidence that in the beginning of 2025, half of Hollywood has been burned. Because nobody in the world is interested anymore into it. And if you look, Generation Alpha, which is the generation Pluto in Capricorn, there nobody or hardly anybody is interested in Anglo-Saxon cultures anymore. They all think Asia, this is much more interesting for us. So things like, for example, K-pop, pop music from Korea, or mangas, or cosplay, they are now going their victory path across the globe. So you see, in the end, it's just a matter of time. Yeah, be silent and wait for your time until the Chinese dragon takes over, because the US hegemon, he's just now old and strange and sclerotic, and so China, for the future of the air age, for all these opportunities of the air age, is by far the much better alternative. So I hope I could help to open your perspective a little bit. So thank you very much for watching, and all the best.